Really an absolute pleasure to be here celebrating the 75th anniversary of the UN, which will take place officially on Saturday, but this event is taking place in the aura of this very big celebration for all of us. This event is on youth peace and climate action, and we are very grateful for all our partners that have joined this initiative. Particularly, we thank the governments of Sweden, Ireland, and Singapore, the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, the UN Office for Partnerships, the Office of the Assistant Secretary General on Climate Action, the Global Challenges Foundation, the United Network of Young Peacebuilders, and the UN at 75 campaign. So thank you for the wonderful teamwork that this event has generated. And before we hear from Mary Robinson, I just want to say that for us, in order to see the UN flourish the next 25 years, to live to its 100th birthday, we feel that we really have to capture the imagination and the engagement of youth, of this 1.8 billion youth in the world. We want to offer them the opportunity to become ambassadors of the 2030 agenda, of the Paris Agreement, of the Youth Peace and Security Agenda. And it is those of us working with governments and the UN, is our responsibility and our duty to provide creative and innovative ways in which how to engage with youth now in this particular and difficult moment that humanity is going through. We really do feel that youth can help pull us through and imagine a different future together. So with that, Mary Robinson needs no introduction. We will listen to her and then we will introduce our wonderful set of speakers. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, young people, dear friends. It's a pleasure to participate in this important and timely event today on the intersections and imperatives of youth, peace, and climate action. To me, these three themes are in fact a trinity, indivisible and the sum of their parts. You will not have one without either of the others. Indeed, I'm reminded of the wise words of my dearly missed friend, Kofi Annan. The human family will not enjoy development without security, will not enjoy security without development, and will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. By the same token, youth won't prosper without peace. Peace won't be built or sustained without the involvement of youth. And climate action most certainly won't be effective without either a bedrock of peace or the fierce clarity of youth activism. 2020 should have been a year where youth, peace, and climate action were at the forefront of the global conversation. This year, as you know, marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, also the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which emphasized the importance of women's role in peace and security affairs, and the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. Young people have played a critical role in all these landmarks and have continued to demand action for peace and justice throughout 2020, despite the constraints imposed on all of us by the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, our planetary health is in a critical condition on numerous fronts. The context of a deadly pandemic, its severe economic impact, and the interaction of both these shocks with the pre-existing existential threat of a climate crisis poses immense challenges to leaders, to policymakers, to multinational institutions, scientists, academics, business, youth, very importantly, and civil society alike. Perhaps the greatest challenge of all is to infuse a sense of sustained urgency into the public sphere, to put real political pressure on leaders to act according to the long-term interests of all their citizens, and to counter the voice of cynical populists and narrow nationalists. COVID-19 has exposed the interconnections between health, economic, and political risks of inaction and neglect. The virus, as you know, knows no borders and pays no attention to national sovereignty. It has left a devastating cost. first and foremost in human lives, but also in terms of economic growth, political momentum, social and racial inequality, and the loss of crucial opportunities for educational and social development for millions of young people across the planet. I think in particular of the many more young girls being forced into early child marriage. It will be essential as we emerge from the crisis and build back better that we use the recovery to supercharge progress towards the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement, and that the commitment to gender equality and parity of decision-making is at its very core. Now is our opportunity to make change happen by design. The foundations of this new design, however, will remain those that have underpinned the global rules-based system since 1945, a strong, accountable, and inclusive United Nations, and the rights and freedoms enshrined under international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. To realize this new design, we will need to listen to the voices of young people. In the climate sphere, they are telling us to listen to the science, and listen we must. In peace and security, they're demanding a rejection of the failed models of the past and an end to opaque, patriarchal, and sectarian institutions and practices that can make peace processes more of a carve-up between vested interests than a genuine commitment to end conflict and rebuild a peaceful, inclusive society. Talking to you today as chair of the elders, I'm conscious that I shouldn't presume to speak on behalf of this eloquent and passionate young generation. Instead, I'd like to end with a quote from one particularly inspiring young woman who has become a friend of mine. The indigenous activist Shea Bastida has been at the forefront of the global youth movement for climate justice, and she said, "We need to recognize each other to bring dignity forward. The fight for climate justice must be done with holistic solutions in mind, solutions that tackle the problem at the root in order to bring forward a just, equitable, connected, and proactive future." Thank you, and I wish you all very well in your continued conversations and endeavors.
Thank you so much, Excellency. And we were so delighted to have you as chair of the elders join the event. And as you mentioned, the youth, peace, and climate are a trinity, right? A triangle. And in this triangle, we can really see how a new world for humanity can flourish. So thank you for that. We will start now the Davos style part of the conversation. We are so glad to be joined by the UN Secretary General's envoy, Ms. Jahatma, the PR of Ireland, Ms. Geraldine Bryan Nason, the DPR of Dominican Republic, Joan Sedano, the chair of the SG's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Action, Ms. Rin El Sain, Mr. Pedro Cuna, Regional Facilitator at LACEMOS, and Ambassador Magnus Lennerston from the Mission of Sweden. Thank you everyone for being here. And as we've promised to make this an inclusive conversation, we will start by asking all of you to tell us if you think that if the youth peace and security agendas and the climate action agendas are compatible. Please open the poll and all of you vote if you think these two agendas are compatible. And if you're not joining us via Zoom, please use your Twitter and go to iPinst and use the hashtag Youth for Peace and Climate and let us know your vote. And I will now proceed to ask the speakers their opinion if these two agendas are compatible, and if yes, how can they reinforce and support each other? And if not, why are they incompatible? Who would like to start? UN Envoy, would you like to start?
I'll go first. Thank you, Jimena. Before I start, I want to express my solidarity to young people in Nigeria and in Belarus who have been calling for institutional reform on the streets of their countries, but have been facing police brutality. And we have seen deaths of young activists over the last couple of days, which has been very unfortunate. So I want to express my solidarity with those youth groups, and also the 33 young peace builders who were assassinated in Colombia in the past couple of weeks. And I think it's very important to acknowledge these issues, because we really can't talk about youth building peace and climate action if we don't acknowledge the issues and protection issues that they particularly experience because of their activism. So let me start with those respects. And to answer your question, Jimena, I couldn't find any statistics, data, or evidence to really make a relationship between these three topics. But we all know from our work and our experience that youth, peace, and climate are very much interlinked. So I'll give you two evidences. One is that 7 out of the 10 peacekeeping missions that we have are actually based in countries that are most susceptible to climate action. So out of the 10 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, 7 of them have peacekeeping missions or political missions. And the second statistic is that these 7 countries actually are some of the most youthful populations in the world. So if you look at countries like Somalia, DRC, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Mali, these countries have 70%, 80% of their population under the age of 30, and they are predominantly youthful countries in Africa and in Asia. And we see these countries in the lists of both countries most susceptible to violence and the countries most vulnerable to climate change. And I don't think this is a coincidence. There definitely is evidence that shows that climate change and peace and security are interlinked. And by having large youth populations in these particular countries and contexts, I think it shows that young people are disproportionately affected by both conflict and by climate action.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We turn next to the DPR of Dominican Republic. Your 1-minute answer.
Thank you, Jimena, and thank you. Good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And from Jay's reflections, I would also like to reaffirm that these agendas are not only compatible, they share also the same need for urgent and ambitious action. And that's critical. They also complement or complete each other. Poverty, security, peace, and climate change are perhaps the biggest challenges youth is facing when it comes to realizing everyone's dreams, the ones we had when we were young. So the impact on them is, and the current situation is absolutely critical. The decisions around these issues need to have, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. The decisions around these issues need to have young people, not only at the center, but with their specific views and concerns as guidelines for our action. That is why this engagement between the two agendas is so important.
It is, and I'm going to have to be very strict with the world. So, Nisreen, you're next, your 1-minute answer.
Well, I don't even need a 1 minute. I'm the answer of the question.
Great.
I'm a climate change activist. I'm a young person. I hope I still am. I think I am. And also I'm coming from a country who suffered from civil wars for 40 years and conflict over natural resources for 20 years. The previous UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2007 said about the conflict in Darfur as the first conflict out of climate change. And I think, yeah, I don't even need a 1 minute. It's just here I am in front of you, a very good example and a proof for the interlink between the three agenda of our talk today.
Thank you so much, Nisreen. Ambassador and PR of Ireland.
Thank you very much indeed. It's great to be with you all. Good morning from New York. Look, I mean, I'm going to give you an Irish answer to your question. So the answer is, are they compatible? Yes and no. the yes, clearly compatible. If you listen to what someone like Mary Robinson has just said, we know we can't transform the world in the way we need to, the way we set out for 2030 agenda, unless we look at the interlinkages between the issues, between the movements, and I would argue between the generations. So I know that the young people on the screen with us this morning are ready to help shape the world that they want, and we need to give them voice in order to do that. You will be listened to, but for all of that to happen, we have to recognize that the linkages between these agendas are as true for the YPS agenda as they are for the climate action movement. So that's the yes part. No, why would I worry that they're no? I think that we still are grappling, challenged by the limits of our visions, the limits of our global structures, the limits of the way governments interact with each other. We heard from Mary, economic development. You can't look at that separately from social and cultural freedom, nor can we look at it separately from sustainable environment or sustainable peace. So I think we need to do a much better job, not just on focusing on how those interlinkages are there, but actually on working on them and focusing on the interlinkages, not how it separates them. And this is a message for the UN itself, because if we can do that, we can leverage our capacity right across the horizon. So there's a real job of work attached to the yes part of my answer.
Great, thank you so much. And last but not least, Ambassador and DPR of Sweden, Magnus.
Yes, I would argue that it's impossible to keep these two agendas apart. They are, and they should be, closely interlinked. The leadership of young women and men of different backgrounds is absolutely key in our search for both a long-term climate solution. And so I think including youth in decision-making, that is a way to ensure ambition and progress. And I think the creation of Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change is a good example of this. Another way to support the agendas is the type of dialogue which we're going to have here today, exchanging information and lessons learned, and really looking to the future for solutions through a shared lens. Thank you.
Thank you. Pedro, joining us from Brazil.
Hello, dears. I'm Pedro Cunha, speaking from Rio de Janeiro. First, would like to say we're really grateful for the UN Special Youth Envoy to remember and recognize the value of the ones who died defending the environment and the climate and promoting peace. The ones who die defending life, for me, should not be called dead. They are, and very happy that they are not left behind. Here you see Berta Cáceres and Paulo Paulino Guajajara, defenders that was murdered here in the region. Answering the question, for me, the agendas are more than compatible, but they are complementary and codependent, as they are built on the same foundation of meaningful and inclusive participation of young people in decision-making and strong democratic governance. And they need the similar safeguards, as the environmental and climate activists require protection to do their activism, and also the protection of the civic spaces that are also pillars of the resolution, the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 and 2535. So for me, they are two eyes of the same holistic global problem.
Great, thank you so much. So none of us really see a separation, and it is really fantastic to, if you think of its origins, the first resolution of youth, peace and security, the YPS, and also the Paris Agreement, they were both born on December of 2015. So for the last 5 years, they've been running in sort of parallel tracks. So the question is, how can we find more mutual connections among these two really powerful frameworks, and how through these connections can we strengthen both? And with that, we will start our Davos-style conversation with asking a question for our UN envoy. So in your role, how do the climate action agenda and the YPS agenda connect? Where do you see those middle points?
Thank you, Jimena. I would like to touch on 3 points. I would say there's three middle points, if that's a way that I can frame it. I think first of all, we need to understand and acknowledge sort of the intersectionality that we talk about this morning, and particularly the compatibility of the climate and peace and security agendas, and particularly, as Geraldine said, how it impacts young people and future generations, sort of the generational impact of conflict and the generational impact of climate action, or rather climate inaction, and understand that climate change exacerbates conflict, but also conflict can exacerbate the further implications of climate change. We've seen how in the Lake Chad Basin, climate projects or resilience building on climate has been impossible practically because of the governance challenges in the region. And if you actually trace back, some of the governance challenges in the Lake Chad Basin can be traced back to issues of climate change, long-lasting droughts, scarcity of natural resources that really sort of exacerbated the violence. So I think in some cases, when I kept reading about those stories, I learned that it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because you have instances of conflict being exacerbated by climate and climate exacerbating conflict. And Nisreen also brought the good example of Darfur and how the conflict started there also as a byproduct of climate change. So with this in mind, I think there is a lot more work that we need to do when it comes to really analyzing what impacts that these two agendas and its intersection have on young people. Because as I said, there's absolutely no evidence available. And we really also look to you, Jimena, and IPI to help us do that research and collect that data and evidence, because right now, a lot of us are working on these anecdotal stories that we hear in our work, or our own lived experience as sort of Pedro's or Nisreen's or mine, coming from countries which have both climate and peace and security challenges. Secondly, I think it's also, you mentioned about the timelines, the 2015 timeline, Jimena. I think it's also interesting that both these agendas are also led by young people. So if you look at the climate movement from Europe to Latin America to Africa, you see young people on the streets. Fridays for Future, school strikes for climate, the Amazon protection of the Amazon forest that happened, young environmental defenders we saw in Brazil. So young people are at the forefront of the climate movement, and young people are also building peace in their communities. That is why the Security Council now 3 times has recognized young people as positive peace builders in their communities. We saw in Colombia, in Sudan, actually Nisreen was a part of the democratic revolution in Sudan herself. And in many parts of the world, young people really at the forefront of building peace in their communities. I remember reading this article that in South Sudan, the peace building activities that the scouts are doing sometimes are more powerful than the peacekeeping operation of the UN. So we do have these very successful stories of youth-led initiatives on both youth and climate and youth, peace and security that I think really brings up the leadership that young people offer, the innovation, the creativity, and the ingenuity that young people offer in advancing these agendas. And these are both forward-looking agendas. This is about our future. Thirdly, it is about protecting the most vulnerable. So in both climate action and in both peace and security, it's the most vulnerable in our societies that are the most impacted. So young women and girls, young indigenous people, young people living with disabilities, these groups continue to be marginalized and continues to be vulnerable through these two climate inaction and peace and security challenges. So I would say these 3 are the key points that I see as intersecting between these 2 agendas.
Thank you so much. And thank you for pointing out that we really need to build the evidence case. And IPI, I think, would be really delighted to help you doing that. So I think this can be one of the results of an ongoing conversation on this. Next, we are very, very delighted to have here 2 representatives that are now serving in the council. We have the Dominican Republic, who has been a voice both on climate change and youth. And we have an incoming elected member for the Security Council. Congratulations, our colleagues from Ireland. So for the two of you, we have the following question. In your experience, why is it important that the Security Council recognizes the relevance of climate change to young people living in conflict-affected areas? The latest Youth, Peace and Security Resolution 2535 does not refer to climate change as one of the realities that youth are grappling with. What is the impact in policymaking by its absence? Ambassador of Ireland, do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. We're delighted to be elected, and really telling you that right now we're limbering up to go to that table, because Jayatma, other colleagues on the screen know us. Ireland didn't campaign to sit at the table and make up the numbers. So we hope to make a difference when we get there. Look, I think one thing that we sometimes forget in all that we're discussing here in this great 75th anniversary is that Mary Robinson touched on it also in her Kofi Annan quote. It's a humanity that binds us. It's a shared humanity that is actually the universality of that thought is at the heart of everything we're supposed to be doing here at the UN. And I think we need to remind ourselves about that. It's our families, our communities, our global health that really matters. And at this stage, you know, after 75 years, the organization that grew out of fights over borders is now dealing with almost exclusively on the big stage challenges that know no borders. That's true of climate change, it's true of COVID. So when we look at a threat that's universal, I think we then need to a reality check to recognize, universal as the threat is, we're not all affected equally by that threat. The strong, the healthy, the wealthy, they find it easier to weather storms. Bono this summer said it about COVID. He said, we may all be in the same storm, but we have very different boats. And I think that's something, as we move to the Security Council, we will be very conscious of. The most vulnerable amongst us are the most impacted, whether that's by a pandemic or by climate change. And that vulnerability then is in a way exaggerated by a host of factors like gender, like age, like religion, like geography. So my view is that when the Security Council fails in its efforts to address international peace and security, it's also failing the most vulnerable. It's failing to recognize this intersectionality. And that is really not just a theoretical fact, it's a reality on the Security Council today. It's those important interlinkages that are getting left behind, and we're not seeing the results. Congratulations to the Dominican Republic for the work it did on the YPS resolution. That was an important first step, a recognition of the centrality of youth, but not just youth, but young voices, I would say, to all aspects of the sustaining peace agenda. We will prioritize when we step up to the Council prevention and early action, and particularly looking at root causes of instability and conflict. And again, I keep going back to Mary, who quoted a grassroots activist. We want to go to the heart of the matter on the ground. We will also push at that table for member states to move beyond what I think, Jayatma and I have had this conversation before, it's a very one-dimensional view of young people that we employ here at the UN. We want to see young people sitting at the Security Council table during debates. We want to see youth voices shape, not just as the custodians of the future and peace. We want to see you shape the way we talk about the issues that are currently on the table. So you can rely on us to do that. I mean, let's be clear now, there are a few issues that really affect young people more than the damaging impacts of climate change, because it's about your entire future. There's very little that doesn't link into that simple thought. And I would argue that because, and the fact is, there is a big resistance at the Security Council table to look at the impact of climate change, and certainly to, as you know, we know the reference to climate change didn't make it into the famous resolution. The Security Council, I believe, in not bringing those two issues together is undermining its own ability to sustain peace, which is, its fundamental duty. And I'll finish up by saying that, we know that climate change is also contributing to all of the issues that are at the root cause of conflict that the Council continues to try and grapple with, whether that's food insecurity, water scarcity, low life expectancy. We know that there are the realities that young people across the world are now recognizing as making the context fragile. And we think if the Security Council in a way denies that by not addressing it, that it's an omission that actually is failing the next generation. And I have to say that's where we will come from. Now I'll finish up. I've seen the globe by saying that we know it's not all about the Security Council. Thankfully, there are other multilateral organizations where much better work is being done. The glory of the Paris Climate Accord, the IFIs are working hard, the Human Rights Council is working hard, and our own General Assembly very often does a better job than the Security Council. So, you know, we have the SDGs in our backpack. Now we just need the right forum, but certainly with the power and the energy of youth to advance that. You will have an ally in Ireland on the Security Council. Sorry for going over the time.
Great. No, thank you so much. You said so much, and we are really delighted that you'll have that space in the Council, which is a very difficult, which is in a very difficult moment right now. Next, we go to DPR Sedano. You have the floor.
Thank you, Jimena. Let me start by saying something. The Council has already recognized climate change as one major driver in some contexts. However, as in your question rightly stated, it has not yet made the connection in terms of how this specifically and fundamentally affects young people living in conflict. So all this, in our view, has to be framed on the prevention agenda, early warning, and conflict mitigation. And this is why it needs to be grounded on young people themselves. They can be, as all of us know, a great asset to achieving both peace and a more ambitious climate action. Conflict-affected countries, but you know, all vulnerable countries, as Jay was mentioning. I'm thinking about the Sahel, but also in other places where the prevalence of violent and repressive environments undermine their ability of young people to express themselves. And one final point, young people will continue to make points to the Council and us member states, the points that we are not making, that please don't stop doing it. And they need to continue to be that voice that calls on policymakers and the international community to do their jobs. Thank you, Jimena.
Thank you so much. And thank you for also bringing that message of the youth having to be the counterweight and not, and that sustained emergency that Mary Robinson said at the beginning, that sense of sustained emergency has to be kept, and a momentum has to be kept in order for all of us to progress. Next, we turn to our Brazilian colleague. Welcome from the Americas. Part of your work you do is building synergies between peace and climate, particularly in this continent. From your perspective, why is it important for the work of young peace builders to have a climate lens and the work of climate activists to have a peace lens? Thank you.
Very grateful. First, I would like to bring up the relation into the environmental dimension and peace. We are all part of the environment. Nature is inside and outside us. We need access to water, food, clean water, shelter to survive and thrive as individuals and societies. And all living beings need to have our basic needs met to live in peace and dignity. However, this access to those are not always safeguarded, and more, the right to fight for those are not either. For this reason, I advocate to promote the environmental defense and the climate activism also as a human right. Today, we already have the perspective how the climate change affects the human rights, but not advocating for that is not a human right. And it's also related to peace builders that do not have any institutional mechanisms and instruments to ensure their physical integrity and safety during their activism. But coming to the question, I will make the two perspectives, the two lenses. First, educating young peacebuilders how they can have an environmental lens and why it's important. I have been in the United Nations Environment Assembly 2 and 3, and I have seen face by face and negotiating the process of the first resolution related. Armed conflict and military industrial complex are huge contributors to environmental degradation. In 2017, during the UNEA 3, the United Nations Environment Assembly, they adopted a resolution urging states to minimize and mitigate the health and environmental consequences of pollution. It's time that UN addressed and recognized the topic, and but just the beginning. It's much more need to be done, but this interrelation was done. Coming to the environmental activists, why they should have the peace lens, it's about ensuring that none of our values, strategies, and actions based on solutions, and we say real solutions, holistic solutions, that do not perpetrate structural violence and oppression founded in colonial exploitation, such as the control of population, resources, territories, especially in the global south that we face a lot. In Latin America, we face decades of persecution and violence against the community of life defenders. Those same countries are also lagging behind in the defense of human rights as a whole. That is true that not only for defenders in the forest or for climate activists in the front lines, but also in the urban and central territories, where militarization and arbitrary use of power do not allow this generation to build the future we want. A safe environment for humans and non-humans is conducive both to peace and climate change mitigation, especially in the more vulnerable communities. But instead, what the same partners of decision-making being taken by and in the global north, while in the global south we struggle with climate crisis impacts. And bringing a concrete example, now in Rio de Janeiro, after the impacts of the FIFA and the IOC, the Olympic Games, now the F1, the Formula 1, this is that poster behind, they are wondering to build a racing circuit in a place, in a forest of 180,000 trees, removing people from their homes. So we also see that relation in a mix of crimes. Most of the time when we have a climate activist, when we have an environmental defender, the environmental crime is the last one in a network of crimes, in an ecosystem of crimes. And as in Africa, for example, ivory and the relation with terrorism is completely disgusting, but it's very well related. The environment is the last crime that is done in a chain of crimes. And I just would conclude that we are nature defending itself.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you for bringing that holistic perspective into the conversation. Last but not least, Nisreen, thank you for joining us from Sudan. Good evening. How is climate change linked to conflict? And in your experience in the specific case of Sudan?
Well, it's very much we are running in endless circle of having natural resources degradation, people depending on these natural resources, conflict over very little natural resources left, and then the conflict became a very big war, and then the war, we start to have a peace building mission or a peace keeping mission. And then again, we have natural resources degradation, and then people depending on these natural resources that degraded already. So little natural resources, so a conflict over natural resources happen, and so on. We continue like this. So I've been following the track of every conflict happened in Sudan since the year of 1972. All of them actually indicated that they are actually between pastors and agriculture people, farmers, and some of them actually happened in places that had small lakes, and this lake had drought, or people had to migrate from one place to another place, or being internally displaced from one place because of the land degradation to another place. and the host community in the other place didn't accept them very well, so a conflict happened. So actually all of the tracks of the conflict happened in a lot of areas, especially in the western areas, eastern area, and the northern area was actually very much linked to natural resources degradation. Well, if we used to have for example, a rainfall percentage of 120, and then now because of the climate change and because of the droughts and etc., we only have less than half, actually 50 millimeter percentage of the rainfall, then I can expect that the survival instinct inside of the people will actually will drive them to move from one area to another area with more water, more fertile land, and then we don't know what will happen in that area. They might find another people that doesn't accept them. And also it's very important to talk about the normal cycles we used to have in our communities. For example, the normal cycle in Sudan was that the farmers grow their crops in the winter while the pastorers are trying to move south. So they cultivate the land with the cattle's feet, and they actually have a natural fertiles with the animals also. So they move south, and by the seasons change, and when the summer comes, actually the farmers collect the crops and they leave only the left of the crops. So when the pastorers came back to the north, they found the leftover of the crops, and the animals eat it, and then they cultivate the land again, and so on. So this was the normal cycle we had in our communities. What happened now? The rainfall started to come later, so the farmers was forced to actually grow their crops later stage. Winter started to come earlier, so the pastorers were pushed to move south earlier also. So the cattle eat the actual crop that the farmer is waiting to sell and to feed their families. So the farmer kills the cattle, the pastorer kills the farmer, and the tribe of the farmer kills the tribe of the pastorer, and it's continuing like this. Actually, most of the conflict in my country happened this way. Yes, wrong policies and wrong solutions made it, but that's because all of the governments we had was actually neglecting the effects of climate change and neglecting the effects of natural resources degradation in all of the pieces. So well, what happened now, I'm very happy that we are moving into a new world, and I'm very happy that in the last peace agreement that happened in Juba, we had a full chapter 10 was talking about environmental degradation, and we have 4 paragraphs that talks about climate change specifically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nisreen, and thank you so much for painting us really the cycle and giving a very, very strong visual example of how climate and conflict are very much interrelated, and how the absence of, the Security Council omitting, and as the PR of Ireland mentioned, failing the next generation by not recognizing it, has also had implications at the national level, because the national government also neglected it. And so you can see how governance works both in negative, but also can work in positive ways. So we are and have to turn the steering wheel into this recognition of these interconnections. So we know that our colleagues from Ireland and Dominican Republic have to run for a Security Council meeting, but before they leave, we want to ask them in 1 minute if they can give us one key recommendation on how to move this agenda forward. Ambassador from Ireland.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would love to stay to hear this discussion. I think it's extraordinarily rich, and I am very grateful to have been invited. I think the most pragmatic and sensible thing I can say to you on a recommendation is that I'm making a note to self right now, as Ireland moves to the Security Council on the 1st of January, that we will become a champion for the agenda we've discussed this morning. We crossed a threshold already. We have recognized that youth is the missing piece between development and peace. We know that climate, peace and youth are inextricably linked, and we know the solution isn't without youth. So all of those things will inform the policy, the disposition, and I have to say the enthusiasm you will get from me as the team leader, John Gilroy right by my side as we step up to that table. So you have your voice at the table, and we will ensure your voice gets to the table. So that's the note to self that I'm making as I leave you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is really wonderful news to hear. And we will need you as our champion, and we will count on you. And we hope to continue engaging with you. And thank you also for leaving us in the good hands of John, who will stay with us in the Q&A. So thank you, Ambassador. Goodbye. Next, we turn to the DPR of Dominican Republic via audio. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jimena. After almost 2 years in the council and having been, championing these two agendas, one thing that I think we have to perhaps reinforce is how we communicate, how we, the messages we are putting through with those countries in the council that are not, as I say, too friendly to this agenda. Mm-hmm. We have to reinforce our conversation with these member states. Even though there are currently 10 like-minded members of the Council for Climate and Security, we have not been able to get any tangible result other than the debates and expert conversations. So we have to break that big wall that separates us and try to find a way to based on the differences and the different views that each country has, but take some steps little by little, but take some steps. I think we have to invite more young people to our briefings, consultations, and debates. This is absolutely critical in our view, because this will continue to build those elements to help us have those difficult conversations. So I am very confident that Ireland will not only continue on the climate and security front, but they will also continue pushing for a hunger and conflict dimension, let's say, which of course has climate change as an underlying cause. So we are very, very happy that they have taken on these critical issues. And again, thank you so much, Jimena and everyone. And I'm sorry for this very bad connection.
No problem. Thank you for joining us as well. And I agree with you that it's up to all of us to break that wall. And the beauty is that the Security Council is only a small part in the climate governance constellation that we have built. And we have the Paris Agreement, which is really the universal cornerstone of climate, and also on youth, peace, and security is also much bigger than the Security Council as well. But that's not to say that the Security Council has to play a better role. And we're so delighted to have these two countries committed to both agenda here. So next we turn to your 1-minute recommendation from the UN Envoy.
Yes. No, I think it's very simple. I would say implement the Paris Agreement. That would be my key recommendation. And I think, if we stick to the promises that we made in 2015 as governments, as private sector companies, as those who are in power, we will be able to prevent most of these issues, including conflicts from taking and mass migration and refugee crises from happening in 2050, 2055. And of course, the second recommendation, if I may, is the Security Council can no longer ignore this issue. The Council can no longer say that, youth belongs in ECOSOC, not in the Security Council. Climate change belongs in development discussions, not in the Security Council. I think we have spent 75 years siloing issues, and now is really the time to reflect and see what mistakes and gaps we've made, and acknowledge the intersection between these issues, particularly on climate, on peace and security. So I hope through Ireland's leadership and through the way that Dominican Republic has paved, we'll be able to recognize that interlinkage between climate and peace and security in the Council in the form of a resolution or in references to resolutions at least.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Nisreen, you're next.
Well, I will go beyond what Jayatma said, and I will say actually raise the ambition beyond the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement is unfortunately not enough for countries like Sudan, and not enough for our generation, and not enough for the next generation also. So let's raise the ambition beyond the Paris Agreement. My second recommendation, if I may too, is it's not a recommendation, it's more of a comment. Well, actually, Security Council is letting climate change in the House right now. It's our role to keep climate change inside of the House of the Security Council, because the resolution of the UNITAMS, which is the new mission, the political mission for Sudan under Chapter 6 instead of UNAMID under Chapter 7, is actually clearly saying climate change and environmental degradation in two paragraphs. So we have climate change inside of the House of the Security Council. It's our role now to lift it up and make it one of the top agenda and as one of the main root causes for the conflict.
Great, thank you so much. Pedro?
So I have some recommendations for different audiences. First, for decision and policymakers, is to urge to protect the lives and integrity of young peace and climate activists, ensuring also a safe and inclusive civic space, that we also seen that in the COVID context, we have lost civic spaces. For young peace builders and climate activists, to collaborate and learn from each other, but especially ensure this interconnected, integrated action and dialogue and participation into the decision-making process, because we have the COP and we have the Security Council, but the experts should be in the both spaces. I know that most of them they are, but they are through the youth, not exactly into the high level, into the diplomatic sessions. So, and the final conclusion is that we need the international crime of ecocide. Right now, there are 4 crimes against peace: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression, and all protect peoples and civilizations. But we miss a key foundation of peace to protect the earth and all its living beings. We are missing this 5th category of crimes against peace, that is ecocide. The world is in climate and ecological crisis because ecocide has been committed repeatedly over decades. Amending the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Courts to include ecocide as a crime is a key missing piece to create this livable world. And a week ago, Sweden became the latest European state this year to discuss criminalizing ecocide after France and Belgium. And this is not only inspiring, but this is bringing the future into the reality, facing the future now. So to congratulate Sweden to be in this dialogue and in this process.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and thank you for bringing the whole issue of civic space and shrinking civic space and how that is immensely important right now. Now we are shifting to our Q&A. We have exactly 20 minutes before we hear closing remarks from Sweden. And here we have a number of questions prepared, but I'll ask Nisreen to start us off with a question from her. Nisreen, go ahead.
Well, actually, the question is more for you, which is, so you said this agenda of youth, peace, and climate change is supported by many organizations. And you mentioned also Sweden and the Youth Envoy office. So I really would like from you to reflect, maybe for the audience or for the people who are listening to us, on how are the different institutes are engaged in pushing this agenda forward, and how us, for example, can engage with the institutes that actually pushing the agenda of youth, peace, and climate change.
Thank you. Well, you know, our dear Youth Envoy has launched the first youth strategy ever at the UN. And in that strategy, you see that one of the main pillars is mainstreaming and empowering youth throughout all the UN systems. So I'll kindly pass it on to her, who would have a much better answer on this. On mute.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as I said, one of the biggest attempts that we need to make, particularly at the UN, is to try to de-silo these issues from one another. And the youth strategy has really provided us a platform to bring youth activists from these different sectors together and really start a conversation, first of all, on what young people and future generations actually expect when it comes to the ambition on climate action, on living in a sustainable, peaceful world. One such example is, for an example, the UN 75 surveys and dialogues that we conducted over the past 1 year to really listen to people, young people, about what aspirations do they see for the next 75 years of the UN. And the first priority was, of course, recovering from the COVID-19 crisis in a manner that, you know, it bridges the inequalities that we see the pandemic has exacerbated, to climate change, and 3 was peace and security. So these 3 were the top 3 priorities that came as a result of the survey that more than 1 million people participated, but particularly that young people said were their priorities for the sustainable future that they all want to live in. So these messages and the demands from young people have been really very clear, but I don't think it has really demonstrated in form of concrete programs or initiatives as yet, especially looking at the intersections between these different agendas, not just on climate and peace, but we try to talk about human rights separately and climate separately and humanitarian action separately and refugee crises separately. And the idea really is to bring all of this together, also in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, as we only have 10 years to achieve the goals, to really put this on a pedestal and to say, recognize young people as a source of potential. Don't look at young people as troublemakers or those who perpetrate violence or victims of violence. Just really recognize them as key partners and partner with them, support their innovation, support their creativity. So we're trying to sort of, through the strategy, get our UN country teams on board to be able to sort of develop context-specific and country-specific initiatives to engage with young people meaningfully across all these issues. But unfortunately, just to wrap up, we haven't seen much support financially and resources-wise from donors to the youth agenda. A lot of the youth organizations do this work voluntarily through informal youth organizations, and we really need to put money where our mouth is. And if we continue to talk about how important youth is, then also we need to invest in them and build their capacities and protect them when they face retaliation from state and non-state actors.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing the point of finance, because part of the changing this whole equation and changing our behavior to have a better UN is the issue of funding, how funding flows are distributed and are really shape the agenda and shape sometimes the priorities of the UN if they are voluntary rather than core funding. So it is at the crux of the matter, the funding question. Now I have a question for our 2 seasoned diplomats from Ireland and Dominican Republic. You know, one of the main insights that's coming from this conversation is that the future of the UN depends on us working better on their interlinkages rather than in silos. How, in your experience, how do you see, like, pragmatically breaking those silos and working more in this holistic way? John and Luz, who wants to start? John, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't like the word silos. I prefer to call them cylinders of excellence. But in terms of breaking down these silos or these false walls that exist between between the three pillars of the UN: human rights, development, and peace and security. I think we have a template in what we achieved in 2015, Jimena, on the SDGs. You know, when we got the world to look at our reality in three dimensions, not just in one dimension, as Ambassador Byrne-Nason said earlier. That's economic, social, and environmental. And that's the answer. You know, that we can't solve these three-dimensional problems looking at them from a very, very narrow, singular perspective in how we work and the policies we try to implement. And I think you touched on the financing element. This is a key part of it as well, in that it makes financial sense to take this holistic approach. It will save money. It's much cheaper to prevent conflict than to resolve conflict once it is broken out, and that can be a very, very powerful rationale. And again, you know, I think that there needs to be a realization as we look to prevent conflict, that if we engage young people, if we address climate change, they can be key elements in our prevention work. Building climate resilience mitigation programs, youth engagement can build social cohesion. It can build our communities, and it can actually lead to people working together rather than the kind of the dynamic that Nisreen so clearly explained to us as the root cause of conflict in Sudan for many, many years. So I think we need to build up our evidence base. We need to be rational. We need to say why this makes sense to work in a holistic way, to talk to each other, to use the template of the SDGs. And so I'm pretty hopeful. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And it's great to have you back in New York. Luz, you're next.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm very glad to be able to share this moment also with my colleague John. We've been knowing each other for a long time, and he has been a very great advocate on these issues. So very glad to share this moment with him. In terms of your question, indeed, the youth, peace, and security agenda and the climate action agenda should not be addressed in a silos manner as any other issue in the Security Council. That's one of the tendencies that we can see sometimes around some countries that also don't want to see development or economic areas being addressed in the council, as to ensure that the different forums do address what, according to these countries, are under their mandate. So that's something that we have to break ourselves from, and we're trying as much as we can to do so. That's the example on the same youth, peace, and security agenda and the women, peace, and security agenda. And as a progress study on the missing piece has mentioned in it, an analysis on the impact of climate change and climatic events in youth, peace, and security is critical for understanding the underlying mechanisms for how forced migration, conflict, and security challenges apply specifically to young people, so that you can see the synergies and how they should not be worked in silos. In settings where environmental conflict takes place, young people do face double burden, and the threats of climate change poses a great threat itself to the development of young people, and it only exacerbates conflict. So that's a great example on how it's important to address them together and not in silos. So that's, I mean, other colleagues have mentioned how the synergies of these two agendas do take place, and those are the best examples that we can really put forward for the council to understand that these issues should be addressed together in a more complementary manner. Great.
Thank you so much. And last Thursday, a week ago, we launched a global tweet chat that was incredibly, surprising to see the timeliness of the conversation. We had over 25 million impressions, which I've learned to understand is a big number on Twitter. But you know what? For me, what it means is that there is a hunger, there is a need to learn how to engage youth globally and how to have inclusive conversations. And what we felt here is that youth are still at the fringe, right? They are not yet at the table. And so it is really a very important moment for the UN to learn how to open up, right? To learn how to open up to youth and to other very, very relevant groups of people. So the question that we have for Nisreen and for Pedro is, in your experience, how has it been working with the UN?
Well, it's good that you said working with the UN, not working for the UN. Yes, we are working with the UN. It's very important to say that it's the exact mandate of the UN Secretary General Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change is actually to keep things honest, transparent, and clear. This is our main mandate. And this main mandate can be translated or interlinked with many actions, but mainly is our opinions about different meetings, different UN entities or bodies, different resolutions, different conferences, summits, how we think this went, and how we think when we think it's a failure or when we think it's a success, how young people think, how young people feel about it, what should the Secretary General, for example, how we see that the Secretary General should do or shouldn't do, or what UN entity should do more, what should do less, etc. But it's all falling under the main concept of keeping things honest, because I think earlier the ambassador from Sweden said that UN is already celebrating or honoring the inputs of young people by having the youth advisory group. But I think it's not an honoring, but they actually recognize the huge effect and the huge effort and the huge movement of young people regarding climate action, peacekeeping, and other issues that young people are involved in. And they know that our first priority is not business, is not earning money, is not our positions, because we don't really care about all of this. Our first priority is the planet. Our first priority is the next generations. Our first priority is sustainability and equity, because talking about equity will take a long time, especially that we are now in the context of peace and security and development and climate. Everything is very much interlinked, and we already understand that. So yes, working with UN was very much dynamic for me. I know it wasn't for a lot of people because of many barriers, language barriers, for example, visa barriers sometimes. It needs people to be privileged actually to have access to UN, and I was very much privileged. I had very good education at some point. I have electricity in my house and smart device that I can connect with you in your virtual meetings and events. It's a privilege a lot of people doesn't have in many countries, and especially in my country. So I think UN can be more open to the grassroots people. Maybe we will try to facilitate the dialogue, especially when it comes to the language barrier and other barriers. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisreen. That's very good. And thank you for keeping things honest and reminding us of those pure priorities and intentions. Thank you. Pedro?
For me, I can see it's two different perspectives again, but interconnected. One is, as Nisreen said, about working with, and other thing is about working for. And I have been serving as regional facilitator for Latin America and the Caribbean civil society at UN Environment for the last 4 years, from 2015 to 2019. And I also have worked with UN Environment in Panama, the regional office, have worked with UNDP. So I have been in the both scenarios, inside and working with. And I can see that in this last decade, a lot of progress have been done. Sometimes it's slow, but it's the way our efforts that is being done, I don't know, since 1985, that the youth is creating these spaces and occupying these spaces. But what I can clearly say is that in terms of civil society and self-organizing ourselves, the UN MGCY, the UN DESA, United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, have this capacity that I said to integrate the agendas, to create this interconnectivity between all the agendas through the youth, something that's not sometimes so easy to the UN. That is why it's have these different segments. So I can say that youth should be seen and also recognized as an agenda, not only at the decision-making process, working at the UN, but also implementing the agendas. As Jimena said, have countries that most of their populations are the youth. So they are building their realities, but sometimes it's not that the realities that they would like to face. So I feel that most have been done. We are in a good progress, but I really hope that that we live in a urgency. We have a climate emergency. We have the ecosystems collapsing. So if we do not recognize the value and the voice and the holistic perspective of this generation, all of us will lose.
Great, thank you so much. We need to build a win-win situation, right? To avoid that. We have two questions for our Luz and John. The first one is, Ambassador Geraldine Bryan fully acknowledged this in her remarks, that the nexus issue. Now that Ireland has been elected in the Security Council, how do you hope to link these two agendas? That's for John. And then for Luz, you have been championing the YPS agenda in the Security Council. What advice would you give to Ireland, who will be joining the Security Council shortly, to continue working on the synergies between YPS and climate? Luz, do you want to start?
You hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No. Thank you. We have heard Ambassador Geraldine, also John, of course, and we're very pleased to know that Ireland will take upon their priorities, youth, peace and security, and climate and security. These are two areas in which Dominican Republic has been championing these two agendas and have been paying a lot of attention to it and tried to ensure that more action is being taking place around it. However, we have put forward many of the crucial role that young people play in this regard. However, it's still worrisome that when speaking or having or deciding on climate conflict issues, young people continue to be sidelined or ignored. As Hayatma mentioned, we need to continue to support young people. When we arrived to the Security Council, we had either the opportunity or the challenge, let's say, of having the presidency the first month in 2019. And we decided that we wanted to bring young people to the table to brief the Security Council, not just on issues pertaining youth, right? But just on issues, in general issues, because we don't understand that every matter affects young people. The first debate that we had was on climate and security, and we brought a very, very smart young person, Lindsay Gretschel, which was from a think tank, to speak on climate and security. This is something that we want to see more, and we really recommend Ireland. I know the Ambassador Geraldine has mentioned it before, to bring more young people to brief the Security Council, not just on climate, but in general, in other matters, in every matter that we can see. We also think that there has to be more conversation with youth organizations and young peace builders, including also environmental activists such as Pedro. This is something that we need to do it in a more systematic manner. We also see that now we have the SG Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. So there's this initiative, which we value a lot, is a milestone, and we understand that there's an opportunity for Security Council members like Ireland to continue that discussion with this group. And when it comes to addressing climate and security in the Council, how sadly, regretfully, we have not been able to address it in a general manner in the Council, which was one of the main challenges that we've had in order to ensure that 2535 did include provisions in this respect. The only mentioning that we have in that sense is 2242, I believe, on WPS, which is minimalistic, but we have seen, as Nisrin has mentioned, other country-specific mandate renewals like Sudan's, right? UNAMID, the mission in Sudan that really do have provisions on climate change. So we have to, while we do keep on striving around the general manner on climate and security to be able to be addressed in the Council, we can make these type of efforts in the mandate renewals and ensure that young people are at the forefront in these efforts. Resolution 2535 also has very good provisions, very good language on human rights and protection of civic space, protection of peace builders and young activists is something that we should ensure needs continues to be pushed for, but also the focal points that has been requested by 2535 in the peace operation missions is really important because we will be able to ensure that these focal points that should be designated do really put enough attention to these matters, and that's something that we need to also work on the Fifth Committee. It has also been mentioned the issue on financing. Financing is really important for youth organizations so that they can really continue carrying out their work. So these are the couple of things that we think are important to keep on striving for. But of course, Dominican Republic continues to be committed outside the Council and support Ireland and any other country that will continue that path. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luz. John, briefly.
I'll be as quick as I can. I don't want to take up all Magnus's time or he'll be very cross with me. Well, Luz, thanks for that great advice. I think it's important to say that when we joined the Council on the 1st of January, we're not coming on with a blank page. It's not the start. There's a continuity there. So we've been following for the last number of years the fantastic work that Sweden did while they were on the Council, what Belgium, what Germany, what Dominican Republic, what Niger, what many other countries have been able to achieve. And we want to be part of that movement. We don't want to say, right, this is our policy. This is what Ireland is going to do. We're part of a group. We're part of a movement. And we want to make sure that we represent this trust that has been placed in us by the General Assembly. We're there to represent 193 countries, not just ourselves. And that's kind of the core of how Ireland does business at the UN, on the Council or in the GA. It's about building consensus. It's about trying to identify the middle ground and bring as many people as we can to that, and not just pushing, maybe a narrow particular foreign policy priority. And that's, I think that's why we had the success we did in facilitating the SDGs in 2014, 2015. David Donohue's work on the New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees, Ambassador Byrne-Nason's negotiation skills in CSW as chair for the last couple of years in a very, very difficult environment. So that's what we're gonna try and bring through. It's more just a way of doing business and bringing people on board. And can I just come back very quickly to some of the points Pedro made that I haven't responded to yet. Civil society space is a big priority for Ireland, and it goes across youth engagement, it goes across climate action. We need to do a better job of linking what we do in the Human Rights Council, in the Third Committee in relation to human rights defenders, in relation to reprisals, with our work on climate action and protecting those really, really important voices. There's also a business and human rights dimension as well, but maybe this is all for another event, Jimena, so I better be quiet now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, but thank you for bringing those dimensions, which are very relevant and which we shall explore. Jahatma, there was a very last question, but I think very relevant, of how youth organizations at the grassroots levels face an incredible barrier of financing. So in 1 minute kind of cue on how can they overcome that barrier, and then we'll go to our dear fellow from Sweden.
Yes, I mean, the progress study on youth peace and security actually revealed that 90% of the youth organizations operate under $10,000 a year budget, and that majority of youth organizations actually operate with little or no budget in their communities. And I can see Nisreen raising her hand. I myself was a victim of this when I started my youth organization back home in Sri Lanka with my colleagues. There was literally no funding we could apply for because we were not registered. We didn't have documents to prove that we existed for 10 years because we just graduated from high school or university. So it was impossible to apply to big funds. But I remember this feminist fund called Frida, who gave $5,000 seed grants for us to continue our work and show impact so that they could help us register ourselves and apply for bigger grants. So that is exactly the type of funding and support that we need for youth organizations. Small pockets of seed funding to help them get started, and then sort of help keep them improving, not just also funding wise, but also mentoring and supporting them network and grow their impact and work. So the Peace Building Fund has been a little successful in this matter, sort of through the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative, but still in the UN, I don't think apart from that, there is any other fund that I can point to and say they're actually doing a good job in supporting youth organizations. So the question was, how can youth organizations adopt to this type of models? And I would say youth organizations don't have to adopt to any model because their model is already working. And it's the big institutions and big donors who really need to let that power imbalance go and adopt to the flexible ways of working of youth organizations and support them to be who they are to continue their work.
Great, thank you so much. Ambassador Magnus Lennartsson, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much, Sweden, for supporting this initiative and for being the facilitators of the UN at 75. We heard many times the famous phrase of the declaration that youth are the missing link between peace and development, and we want to help connect these two agendas. So it was in that spirit that we started all this. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jimena. And let me say what an absolute pleasure it's been to follow the discussions here today and to learn and also be inspired by the many ongoing initiatives and really the richness of ideas on the way forward to strengthen our work on the interrelated agendas of youth, peace and climate action. While this has been among the first events really connecting climate, peace and youth, it will most likely, and in some ways unfortunately, not be the last. Sweden strongly supports the Secretary General prioritizing the inclusion and the engagement of youth in decision making. It is simply not possible to have a serious discussion about what the world should or will look like tomorrow without including and listening to young women and men. It is, after all, the young people who will live longer in the world that we build together today. It is their future. It is our generational responsibility to ensure that we translate the ambitions of the UN 75 declaration, which we adopted here in New York at the UN last month, into action. And that young women and men of different backgrounds are given the opportunity to safely lead and shape their future. When Sweden recently served as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, I think we made quite some progress in highlighting the link between climate change and conflict. We know that in places where the impact of climate change is the most severe, like the Sahel, like East Africa, the population is very young. And it is not surprising that the strongest activism for climate action comes from the younger generation. So we need to ensure that a climate perspective is consistently included in peace building strategies and risk assessments in the UN. And we very much look forward to Ireland and other colleagues on the Security Council carrying this work forward. We also hope that youth will play a very important role in a high-level meeting, high-level UN meeting that we are planning in Stockholm in 2022. This is 50 years after the historic first conference on the human environment in 1972. And we hope this conference will actively involve young people with the aim to find action-oriented outcomes and to achieve carbon neutral, resilient, resource efficient, circular and inclusive economies. Youth are agents of change, and they have a key stake in the jobs, the environment, and the economy of the future. And they have clearly demonstrated that through their activist movements that they have a sincere interest and willingness to support a rapid shift towards sustainable consumption and production. In the same way as meaningful participation of youth is critical, it is also key that a youth perspective is mainstreamed in all activities. Sweden, through one of our government agencies, Folke Bernadotte Academy, is now supporting the UN's work in developing a handbook to provide guidance on how to operationalize youth, peace and security agenda. We hope this will be a useful tool going forward. In closing, I would like to take the opportunity to commend the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, Yayatma Vikara Manayake, I hope I got that fairly right, and the impressive work done by you and your office, and of course Nisrin El Saim, the chair of the much welcome Youth Advisory Group, which I'm sure will is going to play a very important role in moving this agenda forward. And of course, to all the speakers, other speakers, for your excellent contributions, and not least to the audience for excellent questions. And a big thank you to our close partner IPI for organizing this great event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you so much for your warm words. We are all looking forward to Stockholm for +50. I think it'll be a really very important moment to honor the 50 years and also chart the way forward. So we hope to continue working closely with you on this. Finally, I just want to say the results of the poll were 95% said yes and 5% said no. So we almost have consensus in the House that these two agendas are compatible. We want to hear more from you. We hope this is only the first step of building this work and this evidence. And please stay tuned. Thank you very much.